Okay, I think we're ready to get started. Welcome everyone to our second webinar of the Smart Networks Entrepreneurial Series. We have two great speakers with us this afternoon. I'd like to introduce Chris Stairs and Colin McWhinnie. Just for a quick introduction of myself, I am Dan Samiotto, an associate professor in mechanical engineering, also a PI at the Smart Network. So both of these speakers have got impressive backgrounds. They're going to be helping us today sort of understand some practical guidance for how to conduct customer discovery. So in Chris Stairs' case, he holds an MBA from UBC and has well over 20 years of experience in strategic marketing and operational startups. He's a senior consultant with CanadaStartup.com and a finance specialist for Volition Advisors. We'd like to welcome him again this afternoon. We also have Colin McWhinnie joining us today, who started Canada Startup in 2005 and has worked with hundreds of startups since then. And Canada Startup is an organization designed to help entrepreneurs start businesses the correct way. He's also been a featured facilitator and business manager with BCIT Venture Program, Simon Fraser University's Innovation Lab, and Langara Entrepreneurial Training Program. He's been a successful business owner and entrepreneur, operating sales expert since 1997, and his clients since that time have ranged from large financial organizations to hundreds of smaller companies. So welcome to you both. Just so that everybody knows what's going to be happening today, we have approximately about 40-45 minutes presentations from you, and then we'll have a Q&A, in which I'll sort of help curate questions from the audience who can enter them in chat. Anyway, looking forward to your talks. Thanks so much.
Great. Thanks, Dan.
Sounds perfect. Thanks very much, Dan. Great to meet you.
Chris, do you want to get the presentation up and rolling?
Absolutely. Oh, and I've got the power. Okay. And let me just blow this up to full screen. Thanks for everybody's patience here. There we go, and we're all set. Well, that's great. Look, Dan, thanks again for the introductions, and great to be part of this and get invited to chip in. I know everyone's had an opportunity to meet with Colin already. And Dan, you've done a great job sharing a background. So again, just really pleased to be kicking off this next session after your lunch break on Customer Discovery 101. And this can be a bit of an exhaustive topic. So 45 minutes, we're going to do our absolute best to kind of steer you through as systematically as possible, just give you a general idea of what customer discovery is all about. Colin, I'll just jump right into this unless you got any other opening comments to make.
No, let's dive in, Chris.
All right, sounds super. So look, we always like to sort of set the stage a little bit when we get into a presentation. And today we're really going to very quickly run through customer discovery from three perspectives. What exactly is customer discovery? Why are we talking about customer discovery? Why do we do it? And most importantly, how do we do it? If you buy into the why, then we'll finish things up with the how you get it done. And I'm going to jump into the why first. And it comes out of many years of experience with Colin and I coaching entrepreneurs across any number of different industries, actually, and both as it relates to physical products, software, or service. And Colin and I have both been entrepreneurs ourselves. So we've lived this and we've come to understand how important customer discovery is. There's a classic entrepreneurial mistake that's often made very beginning in the journey of the whole development of an innovation. And it's especially something that especially occurs in the world of technologists, engineers, and coders, as an example, is those professions in particular, but many entrepreneurs, they're kind of trained to build. The instinct, as soon as you have an idea about something, and we've all been there, we get very passionate about a notion and a concept, and we want to begin building it immediately. And the challenge with that, and we often refer to this as the build it and they will come mentality, which is sort of the fundamental myth number one in the world of entrepreneurship and innovation, is you can have a really strong gut instinct about an opportunity in the market and a solution and innovation you think is going to fix it. And so you just start going at it, operating in a vacuum, building things out without actually stepping back for a second, saying, well, look, I think I know I've got something here, but have I actually confirmed for certain that there is a market need? Have I identified a pain point with which I'm fitting this product? Number one. Number two, how big is that market? I mean, am I talking about 1 or 2 or 3 users, or are we talking about a volume that could really warrant the creation of a sizable enterprise and achieve real economics? Secondly, I think I have an idea about how to build out this product or innovation, whether it's hardware, software, or some other technology. But do I really understand precisely what the feature functionality sets should be for a particular user group, and why I'm actually building out those particular feature function sets? And then last but not least, circling back to what I said about the size of the market, is then having a bit of a thought with your team about, well, I know there's a product and a need, a product pain point fit, but do I actually know whether I can make this economically viable? Have I begun to think about how I would price this, where I would price this at, and could I generate enough business to make this a sustainable enterprise? And so I've run you very quickly through what we consider to be the 3 critical pillars of your customer discovery journey, which is that before you set out and build anything and embark on this longer journey, this marathon that is the construction of a product, which leads to the construction of a business that leads to market engagement and full-fledged sales effort, is, have I stepped back for a second and asked myself, do I actually really have a fairly solid idea of what I think my market model is going to be? In other words, I've really truly identified a precise buyer need and pain point that I'm addressing. Do I really clearly understand what my product model should look like? What is my solution response? How am I building this? And most importantly, do I truly understand the value that I'm bringing to the market with this product that will match up with that market? And thirdly and lastly, have I taken a little bit of time, and I often call this cocktail napkin economics, like literally, have I just sat down with some core members of my team and I said, okay, I'm really excited about the problem and the product, but have we thought about like how much this is going to cost us? If I'm manufacturing a device, like, do we have a rough idea of the material costs? And as we manufacture this in volume, how much per unit roughly is this going to cost me? And then looking at the other end of my income statement, like, what is my basic overhead and infrastructure, and how big a minimum size team do I need to employ to get all this up and running? Once I get a sense of that cost structure, I can start to understand, what volume of business I need to achieve, and even just to break even. So it's really these 3 market models or these 3 models is the market model, the product model, and the money model, and just hypothesizing around that a little bit to begin your customer journey. So that's the why we're doing this. But now we want to get into a bit of the what and the how. And actually, sorry, one other comment I should make about these 3 market models is this is very much an iterative, self-informing cycle. And we usually encourage you to we're sort of putting up a triangle here, but we encourage you to systematically pursue it in this order, starting with, again, am I convinced that there is a pain that I've identified in the market and it's sizable? And do I really know how to define that market and where to find these people? Step 1. Step 2, has that now informed me as to exactly what it is I'm building as a product and solution to address this? And then thirdly, do I understand the financial implications of all this? And what you'll find is if you go through this journey, they start to inform one another. The market discussion certainly informs how you design your product. Once you design your product, you need to think about the economics of it. And that leads to a discussion, among other things, about how you probably need to price and position this. But then you kind of want to take that back to the market and say, well, I think I may need to price the solution a certain way in order to meet your need. You kind of want to check in with that market before you embark on your start to scale this up and actually build things out, and just check in with the would-be buyers and say, if I can deliver this at this price, is that even viable for you? Can you afford that? So it's very much an iterative process. So now we're going to get into the best practice approach about, okay, hopefully conceptually you understand the model, but now it's, well, how do we flesh that out? Like, how do we begin to understand what those models look like? And we're going to get now into bit of a rapid fire checklist of what the best practice approach is for customer discovery. And I'm going to start off by handing it over to Colin to say there's a critical point to bear in mind first and foremost when you do engage in customer discovery. And Colin, you're welcome to pick it up from here.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. One of the things that we've seen happen all too often sometimes is, founders are very busy, wearing a lot of hats. And really what you're trying to do very often is to find other people to help you on certain things. And especially actually a lot of founders might be nervous getting out and talking to people before they really have all the solution figured out, for instance. So often the decision is, I really would like to maybe hire a couple people to do this, or maybe push it on to some other people that are working with me to interact with potential people that represent the market, talk to them, do this customer discovery process. And one of the things that we've realized very quickly is that it is critical actually for the founders themselves to be involved in this customer discovery process. And there's a couple reasons for that. The most important is actually you are aware of everything going on with the company, the product development, all the discussions that you're having with different stakeholders. You're sort of living this. And part of its customer discovery is you're going to be getting feedback back from, again, really key stakeholders in the market about your product, about the pricing, product market fit. Is it user friendly? All this really critical stuff we're going to get into, a bit of a checklist later. And as you're hearing this, actually, it's really the founder that can make a decision on, is this something, for instance, is the customer feedback, is it critical? And is this something I should take on to where, wow, I think this is actually really worth a pivot. I think this is actually really worth going back to the product development team and putting this in as part of the design, because I can make those decisions, first of all, and I've got all the information in a sense to do that. The other thing is you're going to hear really important customer questions or customer feedback, even just simple phrasing that is going to hit you like a lightning bolt sometimes, because you're going to hear it. And sometimes it really either verifies an assumption of yours or it takes down one. And it's really you that can decide that. You're going to be the best person that's going to be able to make a decision around that. If there's some other person that you're putting this onto, very often that skips over them. Comments like that, phrases, questions, they may not necessarily notice how important and potentially impactful that is on the business. So really important that founders get out there, have these conversations, and ultimately, again, it's going to help you actually with everything you're trying to plan out at this point.
Well, Colin, and I'll add one additional point before we move on to the next slide. Like a classic situation is where founders may recruit some young students, for example, to conduct some form of a survey. And we get it. We've all been through it. When you're an entrepreneur, you're looking for free or cheap labor as often as you possibly can. But the trick is to identify to what degree are you leaning on these individuals to do things that are actually incredibly strategic and may trigger dialogues that they're not capable of handling. And to Colin's point, like quite often a single statement could be delivered during the customer discovery process that a young, very well-meaning, maybe a marketing intern who's got a clipboard and running through a fixed set of questions, they may have no idea the impact of what had just been said. It's only the founder who has the level of expertise to suddenly realize that one statement fundamentally changes my understanding of how the market operates. So it gets, sorry, go ahead, Colin.
Yeah, one of the things I mentioned this morning when we were talking about approaching investors is that having two people in the room actually as part is really, really valuable as well. And whether you're leading the discussion or somebody else is, even just being there to observe and being able to maybe go further with the line of questioning, for instance. Really valuable because you can sit back, observe, look at the body language, listen, take notes. So that's another actually best practice that we found really helps.
Very much. Good point. Let me, there we go. Move on to the next slide.
So, we sort of look at these books very often. Actually, an entrepreneur's journey goes through kind of a typical entrepreneur's library, and these are all great books: Crossing the Chasm, Lean Startup, and the Startup Owner's Manual. For customer discovery, one that we really highly recommend is Sprint. And many of you probably have either heard of this book or read it already. I can tell you that anytime Chris and I introduce this to a founder at an early stage, they may have gone through actually what they think is customer discovery already, and they actually get introduced to this book, either they say, wow, this completely makes sense to me and very helpful, or wow, I wish I'd done this 6 months ago. So again, it really goes through a step-by-step methodology on how to put a concept together with your team, how to put together a customer discovery sprint in a few days. And again, I love it because I find that actually a lot of the best things can be accomplished when people actually get together and actually have a time limit to figure something out. I find some of the best ideas come out of that, very much what Sprint is about. Prototyping, and then again, piloting, actually really kind of following the steps that a good customer discovery process is. Really highly recommend it, and a good read for you.
And I'd add one other point to this, because when Colin and I work as a team, I'm often the numbers guy and the money guy. As Dan mentioned earlier in my introduction, I serve as a finance advisor at one of the startup advisories here in Vancouver. So I'm always thinking about the numbers and how you use your time and resources effectively. And Jake Knapp, who wrote this, by the way, he was a long-standing supporter of the Google Venture Labs. That's where he comes from. So he's applied this over hundreds of startups. It's a quick read, big font, lots of pictures and diagrams. But to give you an idea of the economic impact of applying this approach, and we'll speak to it a little bit more through of what it looks like step by step. Colin and I actually just went through a sprint process in a very modest way with a web application that we're developing. Now, to give you an idea of this, we set a budget, we'll just say of roughly $4,500 Canadian to develop a bit of a interactive web application to support our consultancy. Now, $4,500 doesn't sound like a lot of money, it's not. But proportionally, to give you a sense of how important early stage customer discovery is, before we even engaged a developer to build out that app, we actually mocked up the concept just using Pages, which is sort of like PowerPoint. It's just a simple way to say, here's how we want the software to look. But it was just a series of static pages that we used to animate an experience. And then we sat down with about 5 or 6 trusted colleagues that we knew represented what would be a user type that we'd engage. And we walked them through this static model that literally took us about 4 hours to mock up using Pages. Well, by the end of those 5 conversations, Colin and I realized that about a third of our assumptions about the design and functionality of it were dead wrong, which means, in theory, if we had gone ahead and engaged the developer, out of the $4,500 that we were roughly estimating to spend, $1,500 of that would have been wasted money, because we would have gone to the market and found out that we needed to redesign them. Now, again, that doesn't sound like a lot of money, but to give you an idea, a commercially viable app, web device app, that's easily a $250,000 proposition. So if you start running off and designing an app without going through customer discovery, you apply that same ratio, then there could be about $80,000 worth of development that you put into that app, if you have not gone through customer discovery, that you realize is wasted and you've got to rework. With software, you're talking about easily $600,000 or more in development time and labor. Same thing, $200,000 of that could end up being completely misspent because you haven't checked in with the would-be buyers in the beginning to test a series of assumptions about the market, product, and money model fit. So again, it's very helpful, not only in terms of system and process, but in terms of cost savings and time savings. So definitely recommend you jump into this book. Colin, I think at this point, let's get a little bit more into the hows. I know we've got a three-parter here.
Yeah.
Sounds good. So the rest of this presentation, everybody, is about, we're going to get into the nuts and bolts of how you do this. And again, we don't have a lot of time, but we'll be opening it up to questions afterwards. And again, really highly recommend you pick up Sprint, because that really dives into this in a lot more detail. But there's a three-parter to how you go about customer discovery. And it starts off with just hypothesizing. And it's working with your inner team to say, well, look, we've got a hunch about things, but have we really thought through and role played in our own mind across those three pillars of market model, product model, and money model? And if we had a chance to sit in front of 5 or 6 would-be users of our solution, what kind of questions would we be asking them to make sure we're on the right track? And many of you, I'm going to assume, if you're in the world of device or sensory technology, that some of you probably have some degree of a scientific background or think in terms of the scientific method. And that's very much what you're doing here, is you're setting up a series of hypotheses and then you're putting them to the test. So let's start with the market model. I mean, what are some of the things that you want to make sure you're confirming if you had an opportunity to sit in front of and have just some very personal one-on-one interviews? First one is, well, you think you have an idea about what the problem and pain point is, but are you absolutely certain? Can you define it? Is it a clear and present pain point with a particular market? Where when you talk to them, you can see almost an emotional response. They're like, absolutely, like, this is my most pressing priority right now. And any way that somebody can bring a solution to me, I'm going to be a very happy camper. So that's step one. Do you really know how to define that pain point? And is it in volume? Which leads to question number 2. You may find a pain point with one individual, but are there enough of these individuals that creates a market for you to target? And potentially there could be more than one market. And I'll give you an example of, speaking of sensory technology. Colin and I worked with a client a number of years ago who created a particle sensor that measured particulate in the air at an incredibly finite nano level. And it was for industrial hygiene safety. But that's a situation where they had many markets. They could go after the pharmaceutical industry, the cosmetic industry, the metalworking industry, woodworking industry. I mean, the list went on. And so in that case, they had many markets go after, which then typically leads to another question is, well, what is the beachhead market? What is the first market that I should focus in on? Because that's a classic error that's often made with early stage entrepreneurs when they launch into the market, is they try to address everybody's needs all at once, and they end up diluting their effort. So it's identifying pain point. Are there enough people who have this pain to represent a single market? And if there are multiple markets, which is the one that I really should be focusing on first and concentrating all of my effort on first, so that I don't dilute that effort? And again, these are questions you want to take to the customers and start to evaluate where that opportunity could be. Next step then is to understand within that market, do I really understand who the buyer is and who is making a decision about this solution? And could there be more than one person involved in making that decision? And typically we talk about, there's often 3 buyer types that you need to be considering when you're in a sales process. And they're usually the functional buyer who's using it. But there's often what's called the technical buyer, which is the person responsible ultimately for the adopting of the technology and ensuring that that technology fits in with other systems and processes and is compatible with other practices that are being utilized in that environment. So there's somebody who's patching it all together. They have a technical responsibility. And then lastly, there's the person with the purse strings, the economic buyer, who ultimately is dictating budget and determining exactly how much they can invest in the solution. Sometimes those 3 buyer types roll all up into a single person. But quite often, especially when you're selling into larger organizations, those dialogues need to happen with separate individuals. But you may not know that for certain, which is what you want to discover through your customer discovery process: is verify the pain, identify which markets have that pain, which one I should zero in on. And then when I focus on that market, do I know precisely who I'm calling? Can I identify them by name and title? Could there be more than one person ultimately that I need to get into a dialogue with? And all of this you want to verify during your customer discovery. Last but not least, of course, you want to think a little bit about the larger market landscape. Is there competition out there? Are there politics I need to contend with? Is there regulation that may come into play that dictates how I engage the market, or how I have to design my product according to, say, for example, a certain safety standard or manufacturing standard? So these are examples of some questions you want to put to yourself internally as a team and say, where do I not know the answer to these questions? This is going to help formulate a questionnaire that you can then put to a sample set of would-be buyers. Colin, I'll hand it over to you. Before I move on to the next slide, is there maybe a particular example that you can think of somebody?
I think that might come a little later, Chris, actually,
okay,
when we get into it, when we get into the interviews. Yeah.
Okay, sounds good. So once you've given some thought as to the market model and some questions you may need to test and hypothesize, we then switch gears and we talk about the product model. And again, this is before you've gone out and engaged anyone. You know, you set up that first list of questions as it relates to the market, but then what you may do as a team internally is say, okay, we need to verify a few of these, but let's make some assumptions that we do know something about our market and the pain point. Then we switch gears and we say, okay, how are we thinking about our product and our solution, how it should be designed, how it should be delivered? Where are we not entirely certain about exactly what that product design and delivery model should look like? And one of the ways we often encourage people to think about product design, because again, we all very naturally move to things like product feature and function sets. And really what we want to be thinking about actually is if there's a challenge you're trying to address in the market, and if there's a type of buyer that is experiencing a certain pain point, one of the best ways to evaluate the effectiveness of your product is to run through what we call a life before and life after exercise. And identifying what kind of net outcomes, positive improvements would be triggered in that environment the moment this technology would be adopted. And again, it's a very simple exercise that you can do internally with your team on a piece of paper and say, if somebody right now had this particular problem in mind, what would their life currently look like right now? And exactly what would those pain points, those frustrations be? Let's jot that down on a list. Now let's pretend they've adopted our product and solution as it's designed. Well, let's estimate how their world would improve. What kind of outcomes would result of that would lead to really, hopefully, very positive benefits? And we often refer to what we call the 10 times multiple. With the adoption of your solution, would it not just improve their world, would it improve their world by an order of magnitude of 6, 7, or 10 times? Would it cut your costs down to 10% of what you were paying before? Would it accelerate if you had a solution that helped address somebody who it took them an hour to accomplish a particular task right now? Would the adoption of that solution turn an hour-long activity down to a 5 or 10-minute activity? That is an order of magnitude that's going to get a wow factor out of these individuals to say, holy cow, that's fantastic. Absolutely. I'd like to adopt that right away. Do you ideally want to get a customer to a point where they say, this innovation is so incredible, like I couldn't even do without it now. Like I couldn't even imagine what my life before would be like anymore. I can't possibly let this go. Now, again, these are just hypothetical questions that you're running through before you've gone out and spoken with anyone. But it's an exercise that you're doing internally to say, if I think I know what the market opportunity is out there, given the way I think I need to design my solution, is it going to accomplish these kind of outcomes? Let me formulate what I think those outcomes would be and prepare those in a set of questions that I can then put to my would-be customers during the discovery process. So that's the second part: market model, product model. Then we step into our third model, and we start hypothesizing a little bit about money. And we start to think, okay, let's say we've accomplished step one and step two. We know that there is a pain point with a particular market. It's a sizable market. We're going to be able to sell this repeatedly in high volume. And we know that as people adopt this technology, they're really going to have their socks blown off. Like they're going to find this so compelling they couldn't imagine not using this technology anymore. Then in that case, what kind of value does that represent? What kind of price point should we be putting to this, and how should we be charging this price point? And it gets into a few discussions. We often talk about price points are driven by two things. They're driven internally by your cost structure. You need to ensure that you're charging a minimum price at least to cover costs. So part of what your money model is about is internally estimating how much is it going to cost me to actually deliver this solution. But at the same time, you're going to have downward pressure from the outside world. That downward pressure is going to be coming from competition, and ultimately it's going to be coming from your buyers. They're going to say, look, this is fantastic, but I ultimately have a ceiling on what it is I'm willing and able and capable of spending. So you want to begin to just hypothesize a little bit about, well, based on my internal cost structure that I'm estimating, and based on what competition is doing, I think roughly speaking, I'm talking about this kind of a price. And I think I may be delivering, if it's in the form of software, if that's part of it, am I doing this as a monthly subscription fee, or am I negotiating this as an annual license? Alternatively, if it's hardware, if it's expensive hardware, do I maybe need to think about payment terms and allowing my buyer an opportunity to finance this over time? If it's a $200 device, probably not. If you're selling something that could be worth $200, that you may be selling at $250,000, a very sophisticated piece of equipment that may be going into a hospital operating room, $250,000 to $2.5 million. Then you need to start thinking about, well, how would they purchase this? How big is their budget? Would they maybe need to finance this or lease this in some way? Which will get you also thinking about comparative models and looking at those competitors, or looking at similar devices and products in the market and saying, well, they're kind of similar to what we're doing, and they're charging and pricing this way. So would we be doing the same? And again, it leads to a series of questions. You're not certain, but you're starting to formulate an idea about what it might look like. Again, this is your third set of hypothetical questions you're putting on paper. And this is ultimately what you are then going to be taking to would-be customers during the customer discovery process, which is part 2 of our journey. Now, Colin, I'm going to switch over to that, unless there's anything you'd like to comment on right now.
Yeah, just looking at our time, Chris, I'm thinking actually just to accelerate a little bit, I could give a few examples actually of how this has worked. And then I think I'll jump to how to actually do this and recruit people to actually do the discovery, just to, because I want to make sure we have some time at the end for
Q&A. Yes,
yeah.
absolutely.
So what's interesting about this is we work with some companies that are very close to, I think, the space that a lot of you are in right now or want to be in. And the examples certainly have been, so a medical device, for instance, that they were looking to do some customer discovery. One of the very important things that they found out, they were testing on whether this was something you could actually sell directly to the end user, in their case, a patient. Was this something that you needed to sell through, for instance, a doctor, a clinician, a therapist? And how would that work? So that was really two different things that they absolutely wanted to test in customer discovery. And some really critical things came out of that. And I think just talking through it and for a minute will help you think about this in kind of real terms. So what they did was they recruited a bunch of clinicians and basically tested the prototype of the device with them to get feedback, first of all, on whether they saw value in it, which they did. But then they started getting into how would somebody pay for this? And what they realized is they really needed to segment clinicians, therapists in two different ways. One was there was a group that were private that could actually pay for the device on their own, fairly simple transaction, very easy to test pricing with them at that point. But the second group, which was really where the volume was, were therapists, clinicians that worked for larger entities, universities, hospitals, etc. And really going through the customer discovery process there, they found out how critical it was to understand how clinicians got funding for devices like theirs, coding, what codes needed to be applied to access funding, what kind of business case actually did the clinicians need to put forward to the people who actually made the economic decisions, etc. And so part of customer discovery is they actually hadn't thought of that at first, but talking to clinicians again, it was really, really important to look at different segments and understand basically how different it was as far as how they could pay for these things. The second thing was, were clinicians actually influential in having the end user, in this case, the patient, buy a device themselves? Because this was a device actually that either a patient would go into an office and work with a clinician at the office, or they could take the device home and there was a software where they could actually work with the clinician online. Now, from a business case point of view for the clinicians, we thought that's excellent for the clinicians because they can grow their business. They could actually see more patients because a patient doesn't necessarily need to come into the office. So again, all these things were really important about the customer discovery process with the clinicians and what's the right sales process, to the point where the company now has a really good idea where they should put their effort. They're researching billing codes, which actually, by the way, change state to state and province to province. They're looking at ways actually, because of feedback, on what the device needs to say and do for patients to access government funding and help pay for the device. So all of these things as part of a customer discovery process became absolutely critical for them to understand. And the only way they actually were able to do it was to actually interview and test the device actually with a subset of these people. So very, very important. Hopefully that gives you a bit of a flavor of the kind of process.
And Colin, this is a perfect segue because we've basically wrapped up two of the three parts. We've talked about what is customer discovery and why you do it. And Colin, you've just walked us through an example of the why, the kind of insights that really start to come out in terms of the overall value chain, what it looks like to adopt the technology, what's really specifically most important. We've got some questions. It's a perfect segue into what are the nuts and bolts of the how you conduct customer discovery. And I know there's two parts to that. I'll hand it back to you to talk about the interview process and the recruitment process.
Sure. So again, I think actually, Chris, if we could go to, again, I mean, this slide is fairly straightforward because everything Chris covered in a great way is what you're actually trying to get the answers for at this point. So you're basically at the output of the hypothesis exercise that Chris just walked you through is really now you're ready to present this in an interview or survey stage to a subset of people. I think the important point here, Chris, I'm thinking is the recruitment. How do you get people actually to
Absolutely, yeah.
So again, all from experience and in this space that's very similar to the space you're in. be very selective and target specific individuals, companies with specific messaging. So they actually did a lot of research, looked up in LinkedIn, different kinds of different stakeholders that they knew as far as who would be individuals that would be great to actually make a connection with. And they leveraged their contacts actually for introductions as well. Or they actually messaged people directly through social media, especially LinkedIn again. And that really actually they were able to capture 5 or 10 very good interview subjects from that. But I'll tell you, the absolute winner in this, as far as getting people in as subjects for customer discovery, was they volunteered to speak at events. They put on presentations themselves. They put on webinars themselves, and they blogged about issues or posted information about issues related to the technology that they were actually building. And from that, actually, from the audience at these events and from people that actually posted as part of their post, a reaction, for instance, they may have asked a question, for instance, on LinkedIn about a certain subject. They were able to follow up with a lot of people, because what they found was there was a connection, there was an interest and a connection on what it is their value proposition was, what it is they were trying to help people with, and a lot of people out there. So, and that's what I mean by align your mission with their mission. If you can post things and present information that actually aligns with a group of people out there that are trying to actually do the same thing, achieve the same outcomes, you will actually gather a group of people that will be very, very good candidates for this.
Colin, I'm gonna jump in for a second, talk about a couple of questions have come up in the feed, and I think this is a good time to address them. One of them is, actually, sorry, let me get back to it. Are persons recruited for customer discovery, are they compensated? That can be yes or no, and it depends. I mean, there's certain situations, for example, when Colin and I went through customer discovery, we just reached out to 5 colleagues that we knew ultimately represented end users of what it is we're trying to build. So in that case, we were just leaning on relationships and getting feedback as just a courtesy favor, and vice versa. So we were able to leverage personal relationships in that instance. In other cases where you're engaging maybe a larger volume of people and they're strangers, you might look at compensating them. It depends, because sometimes compensating them can actually taint the end result. It can introduce bias. The stranger they are, the further removed from your circle, that generally speaking, the odds are that you may reward them in some way, offer them a gift card or what have you. But I think in each and every instance, it does vary a little bit. Now, that also raises another good point. Customer discovery often happens in processes, in cycles, and you often begin with a handful of people who are within your closer network. You kind of effectively start with friends, if you will, where you can. And what you do is, first off, because you're with known and trusted individuals, you're working with people you're comfortable with, because it can be, for some of us, intimidating to just talk to an outright stranger about a concept. So sometimes you ease into it by talking to friends and colleagues, but ultimately there's a bias there, because at the same time, if there's something grossly wrong with your model, people who are close to you are often very shy about telling you you're wrong. So you want to gradually transition to people who are further and further removed from your immediate situation. And you'll often have a second or third round of customer discovery, ultimately getting to the point where you're talking to absolute strangers. So that,
yeah, and Chris, the other thing I think that's really important to say, especially again in the space that they're in, is if you have a prototype that people can test as part of this, it is actually a value to them. And that's what we've seen, is that if you're ready to actually provide people with whatever it is that you're doing to a certain extent, there's a value of them actually being able to test it, because again, they want to see the solution too. So I've never seen a compensation model there. They're just happy with the right recruits are happy to be part of this because in a sense, they're taking ownership as well. And that's what you're actually asking them to do is, I've got a vision for this thing. I think it's really going to help who you're trying to help as well. And I would love you as an early adopter to be able to test this with me. And sometimes actually what comes out of that is once the product is fully developed, you give them a break. You actually might give them an actual device, for instance, for being like an early adopter. But I've often find in this case, you're on the same mission actually,
yes,
and that's the way to approach it.
If you're genuinely talking to somebody who has the pain, as Colin said, then they're not interested in a gift card. They're interested in you fixing the pain, and they will put in the time to help you do that. And that will lead into a final topic we get into, which is about pilot partnership. But there's one other question we'll get into while we're here, because I'm seeing a lot of questions about the nuts and bolts. And I'd like to reiterate the absolute importance, depending on where you are at your journey, about working with mock-up and facsimiles before you start building something. So there's a question here about, do you do the customer discovery after you have proven the concept through initial research validation in a lab, or before? And basically for each of you, this journey is going to be a little bit different. I mean, it depends on what you're selling. Some of you may be selling, ultimately selling software. Others may be selling hardware or device. Others may be selling or looking to develop like a system and process that's packaged ultimately with technology. Well, so here's the trick. It much like customer discovery, it is an iterative process. But the first thing we'd say is where you can work with a mock-up first, always work with the mock-up, because you're going to save yourself time and money. If we use the software as an example, don't start coding the software. Just start off by animating the effect of the software using something like Pages or a mock-up facsimile. That would be an example. With device, another example would be, don't necessarily build the device. Spend some money on a 3D printed mock-up. So the device functionally doesn't work, but you may be in a situation where the dimension, the design, the ergonomics of the device are a critical part of the discussion before you start tooling up for manufacturing, even a prototype. It's a lot cheaper to just get a 3D printed mock-up version, not functioning, but something that has that triggers visual cues when you sit down with somebody to say, hey, like this is kind of what I'm thinking of building. Here's how big it is. Here's where we think certain things are going to work. But it's just a 3D model. With each and every situation, it's a little bit different. Now, in the case of the lab scenario, I mean, with a lot of you, you may be trying to commercialize something that you have actually proven out in the lab. Well, that's fantastic. If you've done an initial kind of proof of concept, if you will, in the lab, and you're now trying to figure out how to package and commercialize that, absolutely, you have the huge advantage of proving the efficacy of the core process in the lab. But again, at some point, you need to take whatever happened in the lab and turn it into a packaged, commercialized product. And there is a customer discovery step you can take before you do that, where you can sit down and really go through a, what if I took this process and packaged it this way? It will save you time and money if you can find a way to have that conversation before you go through the packaging, tooling, and manufacturing side of things. I hope that's helpful. Colin, I know we should probably move ahead. So again, we'll have a little bit more time for questions. I'm glad we've already answered a few for you. So step 3 is once you've gone through customer discovery, and as we mentioned, customer discovery in and of itself can be iterative. You could go through a series of interviews and go back to people with a few additional questions.
And Chris, actually, and it goes in stages as well, which I think is important. It's not a one shop, like it's not, it actually goes in stages to the point where you're initially doing customer discovery on the concept. Is this even worth it? Like, is this, then you're sort of, you've graduated and you're doing customer discovery with a real rendition of the product or service, for instance, and you're getting real customer feedback at that point with those early stage pilots, for instance. Then the next stage actually is the customer discovery on, okay, now how do I have to sell this? What's the best way of getting a hold of people, of getting them to buy this? So it never ends, actually, in a way, right? There's a constant gradual graduation from what it is that you're trying to discover.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And there is a point where you're going to transition to a test pilot scenario. And typically, if it's a device, as an example, you're going to get to a point where you have the conceptual dialogue. That may lead to a 3D printed mock-up that doesn't function, but there's some design ergonomics that you want to just run by a few sample would-be buyers. Then you transition into something that's built and functioning, and you go back to these individuals again and say, hey, now I actually have a working prototype. What do you think? Well, over the course of this series of exchanges, and let's say for the sake of the argument, you may have 10 individuals you've really been leaning on heavily for the customer discovery process. What's inevitably going to happen is a couple of them are really going to jump out as enthusiasts. And they're going to become kind of what we refer to as champions. They're like, this is fantastic. And they're really giving you a lot of their time and encourage you and saying, look, the day this is ready, like, I'll definitely buy this off you. Well, the reality is there's another period in your development as an innovator and as a company where you kind of need we call it a sandbox. You actually have to test it in a working environment. And the best way to do that is, of say the 10 individuals you've been having, really promising conversations with, if 2 or 3 of them are jumping out as really strong enthusiasts, you may want to go to them and say, well, look, I tell you what, I'd love to talk to you about maybe engaging you as a pilot partner. And we wouldn't even necessarily be charging you for this technology at this point in time. What we'd be leaning on you for are access to your live environment, access to some of your personnel, access to some of your resources so that we can actually put this to the test. And if you're willing to invest your time, there's no financial risk, but if you're willing to invest your time, that when we get this to a point where it's commercial, then we would grandfather you in with the special offer. I mean, potentially you could use this indefinitely for a certain period of time without even paying a fee, because that's your reward for letting us test it out. Or we might give you a 3-5 year window where you ultimately do need to start paying for it, but you're getting a serious concession on the price point in recognition of all the support you've given. Whatever that may look like, and inevitably you want to get into a live test environment. We often call it the sandbox. And so a couple of quick tips about what that might look like. First off, these individuals, even though they're not paying you money necessarily, we always say treat your pilot partners like they're $1 million customers. Even if your device at the end of the day may only be selling for $500, treat them like $1 million customers, because at the end of the day, you may be selling your device for $500, but you want to be selling 20,000 of those devices. So there's a lot of money here at stake, which means you really want to take care of them and handhold them. And you want to adopt a very clear process, which is basically the best of Project Management 101, which is about, if we embark in this pilot partnership, have we set clear parameters, expectations, and a time frame around when testing starts and when it finishes? Do we have a designated individual serving as a pilot project manager on both ends? And most importantly, on their side, is there a champion who says, yes, I'm going to lead this. I'm going to make sure you get everything that you need to make this work. We're going to meet twice a month. And then you get into a discussion about, well, what's happening during those meetings? Build an agenda and a precise schedule of deliverables around it, so that you can ultimately test these series of hypotheses, and the individual at the other side understands that this is where you're trying to get to, and that you're trying to understand the details of deploying the technology in the environment. Is it actually technically working the way you would expect it to? Is that leading to the outcomes that are making people happy? Is there anything complicated around the onboarding process where you now realize that requires a bit of training? And then ultimately determine what would be a realistic price point. Ideally, it finishes with these test pilots ultimately being so ecstatic with what you've accomplished for them that they will actually give you a testimonial and become a case study that you can then use to drive your commercial engine, which is, I know we're getting tight on time, but that's our final
and
topic.
I think the last thing I'd say there, Chris, is the opposite of what Chris just went through is what unfortunately most companies start out doing, which is we're going to give you the device and you can sample it for a while. And almost across the board, that does not work, because if you're giving it, for instance, to a clinician or it sounds great to them, but then their life takes over, they don't get to it. You don't want to be going back all the time, bugging them to see if they've had a chance to use it. So as Chris said, the quid pro quo is we're going to allow you to use this actually free of charge in return, and then schedule actually what their commitment is to you as far as the information, meetings, data you want back, that kind of thing. It's really important to do up front.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I'm just going to finish this quick because I'd love to have a
couple more questions. Yeah.
But I mean, at the end of the day, it's what Chris and I call, are you sales ready at this point? Have you confirmed through this process that you absolutely have a problem solution fit, and that's been verified by the customers or the pilots? Do you have a beachhead here as far as a market that you can focus on initially, at least, to where you think you're going to be able to make some sales? Do you understand who the buyers is and all those personas Chris went through, as far as, because sometimes the user is not the buyer, and sometimes the buyer you never meet. So do you understand that and what that process is for you to get the device or the solution into the market's hands? What does the MVP need to be? Very, very, I mean, this is such an iterative point, and part of actually what you need to, and that's why the founder needs to be involved. It's so important, is you're going to get feedback from people on nice to haves. Oh, this would be great if you did this, or if the product did this. What you really need to make a decision on is it a need to have, meaning that this is either going to be sold like this or not, unless we have this functionality. And it's a really, really critical point for you to figure out, because a lot of product development teams get bogged down by putting in nice to haves. The problem is you're not selling it at that point, and there's a delay when you could have pulled back and actually sold something effectively without 3 of the 4 things that actually the product development team's trying to put on. What's the price point? And again, case studies are everything. If you can get feedback from one of these pilots to where it's proven out all your assumptions, which is it works, it provided an outcome for me, it's providing a benefit, and it allows me it's improved my business or my patient outcomes, whatever it is, by X amount, you can take that and really now build a sales process around that. Chris?
I think we're close to the end. I'm just double checking to see if we have any other questions. It looks like we helped a few people out with some of our responses here. So yeah, I think we're basically wrapping up at this point, Colin.
Yeah, I mean, one of the questions actually was, should we do individual interviews or focus groups? I love individual interviews with representatives of who, again, is going to make the decision for your solution. That's the real stuff right there. So you might start with at the very beginning, focus groups are great to sort of test a concept, for instance, that type of thing. But the really important information that Chris went through that you need to get is going to come from individuals where you could spend time with.
And Jake, you'll find, I mean, again, we'll reiterate the Sprint by Jake Knapp, that book we referenced earlier. The Google, you can imagine the resources that Google has available. And Jake worked with hundreds of startups, and they actually discovered that as few as 5 conversations, especially if you're talking about a B2B solution of some kind, business to business, or a specialized product, It's as few as 5 meaningful conversations will very quickly help you to start trending, what really matters and what doesn't matter. I know it goes against any of you who are trained on statistical confidence levels and so forth and so on, but in the early days, a lot of this is really just moving very quickly through some instinctive discussions about, and a lot of it is about getting emotional response more than anything else. The moment you see somebody light up and kind of jump across the table at you, when they say, really, is that what you're working on? That's absolutely fantastic. And they start investing their emotion into this conversation, that's when you've probably got something. And it only takes 5 or 6 of those conversations to begin to suspect, okay, I think I've got something here. And then you go through the rest of this rigorous process that we call customer discovery. Okay. Any other questions? Sorry, I see a couple of things coming up in the chat feed here.
Or Dan, or
yeah, I was just about to say, unfortunately, I think we're out of time because we should probably be moving on to our next session, unless I get any kind of counter indication from Martin here, who also looks like he may be trying to bring up the same point. But this is a phenomenal presentation, wonderful questions, and great stuff here, because it's something that, again, we don't really get to see enough of, I think, as lab technicians and researchers and scientists. So wonderful to see this stuff. And I want to thank you once again for your participation and your wonderful presentation.
Great. And we're happy to give feedback. If you want to send the questions to us, we will take the time to get back to you.
Yeah, we've got emails here on the, so Colin or Chris at canadastartup.com. Don't hesitate to reach out.
Yeah.
And Martin, good to see you, by the way. I see your face on camera. Great to connect. Yeah.
Anyway, thanks everyone.
Thank you so much, Colin, Chris, Dan. Fabulous job. Really interesting topic. Really appreciate it. I just wanted to have a quick word with the students before they go to the break. And there were just 2 things that have struck me in various different chat messages I've received. Number one is that several graduate students have asked for a definition of a pitch. So I was thinking, while we still had Colin and Chris here, can you give us a 5-second pitch on what is a pitch?
A pitch is a succinct description of your solution.
Perfect. And the outcome of what the outcomes will be if that solution is adopted.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I'm going to throw into the chat one example of some good pitches, 5 amazing startup pitches that you can take a look at. I'm not sure this is the best resource. So Colin and Chris, if you happen to have a couple of good resources that you could send to us by email that we can just put into our resource library that we're building on what is a pitch, that would be awesome. There was one other thing, and that is some students are not aware of what LinkedIn is. And so what I suggest is that actually within your team, the students actually inform each other as to what LinkedIn is if you don't know what LinkedIn is, because I think Colin and Chris just referred to it as an important resource. I would strongly advise you to be aware of what LinkedIn is, and I would strongly advise you to get an account and get on it.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. It's free to start. It's basically Facebook for the working world. So absolutely. And Martin, by the way, I see one other question, and Colin, I don't think we have a challenge sharing the slide presentation with the team.
No, that's fine.
We can email it to the organizers, so no problem at all.
Oh, we really appreciate that, and we'll put that into our resource library as well. So everybody, we're now going to take a half-hour break, so we're going to be back at 1:30, and you remember that we must now go back to the link that we were using for the workshop when we came on this morning, which is in your calendar and other places. So take a good break, and we'll see you back at 1:30.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Everybody, take care.
Bye.